Sorry about the crowd.
That's fine. Beats my record, actually.
I stand up there, Roger, to introduce you, is that right?
Yeah.
Gosh, it's very bright up here. I'm going to stand down here because it's so bright. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Patrick Holden to UCC. Patrick is based at the Plymouth University in the UK. Patrick is also a neighbour of mine from Viewmont Park in Waterford, where we both grew up together. So we both ended up in the same profession and, broadly speaking, looking at the same areas of research interest. So Patrick's work is hugely interesting, and he's been doing a lot more work on Brexit lately and making some very important contributions. So it's a real pleasure to welcome him to UCC, and hand over to you.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks again for the invitation. It's great to be back in Cork, and thanks everyone for coming out in Rag Week. So my theme for today is change, really, the kind of global transformation that's been going on and what it means for Europe, and the various kind of avenues we can take it down. The title was originally inspired by, it was last December, Chris Grayling, the hapless UK Transport Secretary, announced he'd given a contract of 13.8 million to a company, Seaborne Ferries, that had only just been created a year ago and didn't actually have any ships to transport goods in the emergency scenario of a no-deal Brexit. Apart from other juicy details, such as they seem to have copied their terms and conditions from a pizza company on their website, what really struck me about this was that this was the UK, this country that's been at the absolute core of global neoliberalism, that's been spreading, privatization within its own country and abroad, promoting market forces, deregulation everywhere, was now paying, and he justified it by saying it was a British company. I'm giving money to a British company to, in the scenario where we're basically putting sanctions on ourselves by leaving the EU without a deal and transporting basic goods across the water. So this was really, for me, a powerful illustration of the change that's come about in a few short years, and I wanted to look at that more closely. It did strike me as well that Christa Berg, lyrics of Christa Berg have a lot of wisdom in them, and Chris Grayling sort of considered his song, "Don't Pay the Ferryman, Don't Even Fix a Price." Christa Berg was actually referring to this Greek myth of Charon, the ferryman who brings dead souls from this world to the other. You have to give Charon a gold coin, and this led to the practice of leaving gold coins in the sockets of dead people. It's kind of a metaphor for political economy in general, this link between the material world and the spiritual or the ideal, and political economy is really about this link between material forces of production and then ideas about identity, power, values, authority, politics, basically. Also, you can't let it pass without noting that from the farce of Brexit to the tragedy of the Mediterranean, the tens of thousands of people that have lost their lives trying to cross into the entity that Britain is trying to flee from. So what I'm looking at today really is this idea that what we could call the global neoliberal order has ended, and I want to see, but it's ending in strange ways. And I want to look at the Brexit story and how it's unfolded. Also link that in with Donald Trump and the broader changes he is forcing to the global political economy. We'll look then at the world in general and how people are understanding what is this new world. It's not clear what the dominant kind of force or rules of it are or will be. And then we'll return back to Europe, and I'll look at how the EU is dealing with these challenges and the implications for countries and politics. Obviously, some of the politics we can leave for discussion. I'm not going to go too much into theory per se. I will be mentioning concepts, and I'll be talking a lot about language and framing, how different actors have framed international economics and geoeconomics, by which I mean the spatial power arrangements of economics. Geoeconomics is sometimes contrasted with a more globalist, abstract view of transnational economics. Geoeconomics brings the geopolitics back in and thinks about power and so on. So what do I mean by saying, although it's not particularly controversial, that the world we're in has been broadly one dominated by neoliberalism? Well, there are a couple of big caveats. First of all, no institution or state is entirely dominated by any one idea or is faithful to that. So obviously it's always more complicated than that. The US was never purely neoliberal, and although it definitely isn't now, and so on. The same goes obviously for the international order, which has always had lots of things going on. But I do think it's reasonable to say that the dominant ideology, certainly what's dominated political rhetoric, and to a fair degree behavior of the most powerful actors, has been embedded in what we call neoliberalism. Now, what do we mean by neoliberalism in plain English? We mean the belief that private market forces should determine economics and economic development, with a limited role for the state and political institutions. That's it in a nutshell. This is linked with all kinds of other policies, including the support for trade liberalization to increase competition, a general sense of openness, which means openness to outside investors, a general privileging of the rights of companies and economic actors over governments or, of course, ordinary people, and lots of common phrases, the idea of the world market, the idea of global supply chains that everybody wants to be part of, generally and importantly, a sense of depoliticization, a sense that the world should work according to market forces and economic rationality, not according to things like, certainly political identity and so on as well. There was what I'd call a teleological approach to a lot of this discourse, in that it assumed, and you can see this in the EU's documentation as well as other actors, assumed that the world was gradually moving towards a more unified, liberalized world market. Bumps along the road, obviously, Russia wasn't neoliberal, and China was, in those days, hopefully for its adherent going to fully liberalize, but wasn't clear. And so, but this was generally assumed to be the path, and it was also a vision that was essentially comfortable for North America and Europe, which still, with their allies, dominated the global economy. Now, within the EU, you could see this filter through even the policies like development policy, which, again, I wouldn't stereotype it as purely neoliberal, but was essentially embedded with a belief that market forces were the dominant development force, and that integration into the global economy was key for development, and so other more interventionist policies were linked to that. You can also see it, of course, in universities, British universities, a classic example of this ideology in action, where government's gone to great pains to make a market, make more of a student market for in the higher education sector and so on. Now, neoliberalism is, most academics certainly would have been highly critical of it. I mean, when I was doing my initial research in the early 21st century, this was the great target for criticism, and rightfully so. Certainly environmentally, certainly in terms of poverty reduction, it had much to be desired and was simply not sustainable in various ways. However, neoliberalism was at least, I would say, at least at the ideational level, it was cosmopolitan in a sense. It wasn't aggressively sectarian or racist. And the great social scientist, sociologist Manuel Wallerstein once noted that the neoliberal world wouldn't last forever, but what replaced it might even be worse. Now, I don't necessarily want to depress everyone on a Wednesday afternoon, but that is certainly a framework thought for this paper. So, moving on to Brexit and what's been, I think, at the heart of a lot of the confusion, because the funny thing about Brexit is, of course, both sides claim to want free trade. The EU claims to have been the bastion and the means of free trade in Europe and globally, while at least most of the leading Brexiteers also claim to be evangelical about free trade. Now, what's at the heart of this contradiction? Essentially, the leading Brexiteers have been really drinking the Kool-Aid, really, about neoliberalism, and they've actually imagined a world that had more free trade, that was more free trade orientated than it actually is. One point I noted previously was that neoliberalism and free trade dominated ideologically, but not always in practice. And in trade politics, this is one of the areas where it hasn't. In the WTO, and the aim of the WTO is to liberalize, trade gradually and provide a level playing field, whatever that means. But this had only been done to a limited degree, and most countries still bargain for market access, using their own protections as a lever to get market access to others. So actually quite different from any kind of ideal of free trade. Anyway, these subtleties, I think, were lost on many of the Brexiteers. And as Liam Fox noted, expressed brilliantly in his expression of a post-geography trading world, and this is very useful, but it's because it's precisely wrong. Of course, geography is still massive, and the most basic element of most economic trade analysis is the gravitational model, which says that being large, size and distance matters. So a large entity close to you, you will trade with inevitably much more than one further away. There's an element of Father Ted, kind of very near, big, very far about this, but we won't dwell on this. But essentially, they've come up with it's a minority expert discourse. There are a few experts, people might come across Shankar Singham and some of his ideas and associated think tanks, have this vision of free trade which is based on essentially equivalence and very, very light legal agreements. And this was their vision of free trade. And they've come up against the European Union, which knows full well how trade actually works and knows the power it has from being the legal centre for a regionalised trade and production and economic network in general. And this has been at the heart of a lot of the disappointment. And of course, we won't dwell on this, but I'm happy to take questions in the aftermath. The Irish border, one of the reasons it's been such a problem is this is where the rather abstract ideas about free trade of the Brexiteers meet reality, because here you come to the question, if you're breaking away from the EU's customs union, they're going to have to, and the single market, they're going to have to check. And that's been something that they've tried to kind of wriggle around by saying technology can handle it and so on, but technology, as yet at least, can't handle it, and probably can't ever. You would always need a political agreement to recognise the quality and safety and standards of goods as well. And so what's really behind the border issue, or I suppose the latest kind of border crisis, is this actually deep geo-economic interests. The UK's desire as a quite large economy to break away from the EU legal setup, and the EU's desire, not to let it easily, or at least the EU's understandable refusal to allow the UK to get free access to the European market without following the rules. They will make some compromises for Northern Ireland, but not for the UK as a whole. It's too large, and it's potentially a large part of the European economy outside of the European rule system. One thing I also noted, which again goes back to some of the contradictions I meant at the beginning, is how inside Britain in a domestic political debate, actually things have changed in interesting ways. And this is under the force of external pressure and maybe you might even call it a revolutionary dynamic. As I said, most of the original Brexiteers were in favour of neoliberalism or even economic libertarianism, this completely laissez-faire approach to economics and life with very low government role for better or for worse. Interestingly, this journey you can also see in political parties as well. UKIP itself began as an economically libertarian party with just ideas that the EU, wasn't capitalist enough for it. That was the big problem. The EU was too socialist, which would make most people laugh, but that was their idea. And in Germany, importantly as well, the AfD began very much with an issue about the euro and how it was managed and ideas of a strong currency, quite minimalist ideas like that. So how does this mutation, this kind of transformation happen? Well, I think the key fact is that economic libertarianism isn't particularly popular. Certain number of wealthy people like it. Some young people with a lot of energy may be attracted to it, but most people who are involved in everyday life see the problems and will not support totally capitalism red in tooth and claw approach. In particular, in the Brexit referendum, of course, people found, the Brexiteers found that what was most effective for them was a form of economic nationalism, very basic one of keep our money, and of course migration, kind of look after our own and so on. This was what pushed them over the line. If it was an economic libertarianism campaign, it might have gotten 5.2% of the vote, but not 52%. And now we're in a situation where perhaps against some of their expectations they achieved their objective. They can see that it's struggling. They're outmatched by the economic forces against it. So they have no choice but to double down. And you see a lot of complaints again from conservatives about how immigration has been driving down wages of low workers, which is absolutely not on their radar in general. You see within the UK, whereas a few years ago the deficit was the burning issue of the day, the budget deficit, now that's just forgotten about, and they're shelling out, possibly billions for a new satellite system and going to fund, Labour constituencies with development funds and so on. You would think that the deficit had gone away. Only 4 years ago, Ed Miliband was painted as a communist fanatic just for wanting to reduce it by a little more slowly than the Conservatives have, whereas now it's just apparently open season on spending. Now we could again wonder how skin deep that goes, of course, but certainly in terms of rhetoric, it is noted that noteworthy that it has changed and that the Brexiteers have ended up going for this economic nationalism approach. What also interests me, and I don't have too many slides, but is that the EU's response to this and how it's forced the EU to explain more explicitly the difference between being a member of the European Union and being outside. Now, some of this is a question of tone, and some of it is obvious. Clearly, there has to be a benefit from being in the EU from being outside. However, the EU had in previous decades very much emphasized in dealing with outside actors that practically the sky was the limit in terms of how much they could access the European Union market, and that they should be willing to make sacrifices and adapt conditions to do this. Whereas in tone now, they've had to adopt a more kind of defensive approach just because the UK has been pushing for a very vague, full access free trade deal without following the rules. So what have they done? They've very sharply differentiated the rights of EU members via the single market and the customs union from other partners. So obviously they've been stressing, while normally praising the WTO a lot, they've had to stress how terrible and rough WTO terms trade are, for a country like Britain. What a downgrading that would be, all the hassle, all the checks, high tariffs in various areas. In some cases, even within the EU, for possibly the first time in recent years, they've had to even connote trade as a threat, just a kind of threat of giving the UK free access either via Northern Ireland or elsewhere, threat to safety, threat to the order of the Union, and so on. They've even stressed the limitations of the kind of top-level free trade agreements they have, like with Canada. Again, they've said, look, you wouldn't like the Canada deal, doesn't have financial services, doesn't get rid of all checks and bureaucracy and so on. And Barnier has even gone on and explained how the European Economic Area, where they do adopt a lot of EU law, isn't frictionless trade either. So because of this political dynamic, they've really had to stress this vocally for the first time. They've also, interestingly, very much had to put power and politics and principles above commercial imperatives. Because we must remember the UK is a massive market, probably the largest single market with the US outside of the EU, outside of the EU proper, assuming it does leave. So what Barnier has said, look, we can't do any very bespoke, extra flexible deals for the UK or giving them a voice, even though I know you want access to their market. So you've got to put our own autonomy of decision making above these commercial interests, thinking long term and so on. Also stressing very much the power relation to this and how this the EU's solidarity and integration allows it to set standards for the rest of the world. Generally, they've stressed that these are very correctly, by the way, very uncertain times in the global economy, and that you need to be part of a large trading bloc of what Barnier called the Heimat market, the home market to a German audience. Contrasting again the EU as a zone of laws and rules of trust, with outside being kind of like law of the jungle, which isn't exactly how they had been describing things in other documents. They talk a lot about the WTO and the gradual legalization of world trade and the need for developing countries to just link into these global supply chains and everybody's coming together. Whereas because of the Brexit threat, they've had to adopt a more, call it geo-economically realist stance, slightly maybe, even though a lot of it is by the way, justified and indeed common sense. The tone is noteworthy. And what this struck me, like I said, having spent a lot of time looking at how the EU talks to neighbouring countries and other developing countries, again, you do see some contrasts and potential rhetoric traps here. A rhetoric trap is when you essentially get yourself in trouble by stating something that you will then find hard to live up to. Think of Theresa May for the past 2 years, more or less every day. There's a rhetoric trap. So countries like Morocco and Tunisia had been told that, look, you can align with our rules and you'll have integration into the EU single market, not necessarily free movement of people, by the way, which is another slight disconnect. Slightly less comprehensively, though, the EU obviously had very tough negotiations with African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, initially asking them to align a lot with EU law. And again, they were saying, we know this is difficult for you, but the sky is the limit for your access to our deep and large market. I can't help wonder, and it might be, of course, for future research, how their trade negotiators feel when they hear Barnier and Juncker going, actually, those trade deals are pretty crap, for the UK. It is a little bit like you're trying to sell a used car to one person, and then a richer person comes in and you go, well, that's crap. I wouldn't go near that. Again, this is logically justified. Obviously, Britain is in Europe, which does mean it's a different requirement needed, and it has been in the EU. But still, it jars, and it's an interesting one for the future. Okay, so I'm now contractually obliged to talk about Donald Trump, who is, whatever we think of him, obviously a massively important figure, a psychological phenomenon, really, in many respects, as well as a political and economic one. Feature of Trump that I want to note is that even more so than in regards to security, Trump has absolutely broken with every mainstream president or political leader's rhetoric on trade, by which, since World War II at least, America has always been, free trade is great, leads to freedom and more development. Haven't always practiced that, but that has been the rhetoric. Whereas Trump, of course, is a very, what you call, neo-mercantilist, which essentially means, imports bad, exports good. And deficits are terrible. He sees trade as a zero-sum game, contrast being obviously an absolute game is where everyone can win. Zero-sum game is where you're a winner and a loser. Most people are pretty sure this comes from Trump's own business practices, where in dealings with Trump there was one winner and it wasn't you, generally. It could well be. Also, of course, together with perfectly actually valid criticisms of US trade policy, is linked with a form of xenophobia as well. And Trump and the Republicans have not focused on many of the other inequities of capitalism. They focused on that element that is linked with the outsider. So it's linked with Mexico, China, Germany, and so on. That's the problem. It's not, in fact, it actually is, the problem isn't the inequality and the ever more unequal tax system in America, for example. And Trump has also followed up on his rhetoric to a degree. He clearly, obviously, he dislikes most multilateral organizations and dislikes the WTO intensely, insisting that America loses most cases it brings to the WTO, when in fact America wins over 85% of them. But this is his idea. He wants bilateral trade deals with countries, again, for obvious reasons. He can use America's unique power and weight to squeeze out a better deal than in some kind of multilateral forum. In terms of what he's done, he's put tariffs globally on steel and aluminium, 25% and 10%, which is leading to complaints in the WTO. Generally, he's ignored the WTO to a large degree, and his major kind of conflict with China has been mostly outside of the realm of the WTO, and we'll go through that in a moment. Trump's team obviously is a mixed bunch. Gary Cohn, who's resigned, isn't there. Gary Cohn from Goldman Sachs was of a traditional, global neoliberal view. He just said to Trump, "Look, these trade deficits don't matter. It's just cheaper goods for us, and it's just economic efficiency and so on." I think probably most mainstream economists would agree with that. Certainly, they'd all agree that an individual trade deficit doesn't necessarily matter. It's not a football game as such. And so, but Trump has the idea, obviously, that if one country is selling more to America than vice versa, it's a problem. Mnuchin again would be pretty conventional. Lighthizer, who's become the main figure, is from the Reagan era. And Reagan was a free trader in rhetoric, but actually took quite tough action against countries like Japan as well. So he's kind of, I would say, a liberist trader. Navarro is the one with the most far-reachingly different views, who everybody tries to keep Trump away from. And Navarro has a view similar to Trump's about trade deficits being a massive problem, and China in particular being a problem. So China has been the main target for Trump, and what he's done is, beginning in March last year, he put 25% tariffs on 50 billion worth of goods, then put 10% on 200 billion worth in last September, and they're supposed to go up as well. And his argument, not entirely invalid, is that particularly China's role in technology transfer and in enforced cooperation, and perhaps also in cyber intrusion, although a lot of countries do that, means that it is cheating. And Trump says that most of these issues have nothing to do with the WTO because it doesn't cover them, but by going totally apart from it is damaging the institution a great deal. There's a deadline coming up, and maybe they'll reach a deal. What Trump, of course, isn't exactly fond of the European Union either, and although in his own way he's a great advertisement for it, every time Trump meets an individual European leader, whether that's from a large country like Merkel or a smaller country like Rutte, and says, "Do you want a bilateral trade deal with me?" And they say, well, we'd really love to negotiate a trade deal with you, Mr. President, but we have to let the European Commission do it, sorry. Because, again, with Trump, there's a method to this. It sounds ignorant. It's not how the EU works, but he is obviously, his logic is correct in that he could squeeze a better deal out of individual countries. Trump is hostile to the European Union, but unlike China, where I think his administration is behind him in general for various reasons about in dealing with China, it's more nuanced with the EU. So Trump has put steel and aluminium tariffs, but hasn't yet bitten to follow up on his various barks. Trump and Juncker are a lovely couple. They signed. Juncker said, Trump said to him, "Jean-Claude, you're a killer." I think he meant it as a compliment, and probably did. But he went to Washington last year and signed one of these deals, which are very crude promises to buy lots of things from America. Trump's view of trade is actually close to what went on in the Soviet trading system, where one country might say, Hungary might say, "Yeah, I'll buy 500,000 machine tools from Germany, from East Germany, and you buy so much oil," and so on. Basically, he wants leaders to agree how much they sell to each other. So in China's case, he's actually pushing them to buy more, but he's actually asking China's government to control more of the economy. If you think about it, because he's saying, "We want you to definitely buy, more soybeans or liquefied natural gas or whatever." How am I doing for time? Fine. Yeah. That's a vague answer. Fine. Yeah. Obviously, Trump has damaged Europe greatly, though, in various senses, pulling out of the Iran deal and the Paris climate change agreement. Note the European reaction to the Iran deal, including the UK, which has been to try and maintain it, and even to set up a different financial instrument outside of the UK's or the US's financial reach. Again, another sign how Trump may be damaging American hegemony with his very direct and crude America First policy in various relations. So all of this means that what had been happening anyway, particularly most obviously since the financial crisis, which dealt both an ideological blow to neoliberalism and a real economic blow to the leading countries of the West. If you combine that with emerging powers in general, which were pro-trade or capitalist, but not of the neoliberal style, and only partially integrated into things like the Davos circuit of elites and the financial markets and so on. You have countries like China, above all, which are capitalist but not liberal, or let alone neoliberal capitalist. And you have this incredibly ambitious Chinese One Belt, One Road, which I call a neo-Keynesian geoeconomic project. It's apparently going to involve up to $900 billion worth of investments. None of this is to say it's going to work, but as a sheer demonstration of power and ambition of governments, shaping infrastructure and markets, it's again a striking illustration of a different way of looking at the world. But if you add to this mix Brexit and Trump, you do get a world transformed, which isn't to say that neoliberalism is gone, at every level or at the domestic level, obviously, but certainly as a dominant ordering ideology, it seems to be. Ideas about where this might lead. This is from a group at the World Economic Forum. So obviously, they have their own interests and ways of talking about it. But what they'd like would be a revitalized WTO and what they call open international rules, new multilateral rules on data transfer maybe, and a new multilateral global economy. Very unlikely to happen. In terms of what other scenarios that are maybe more likely, interesting ones, this involves cooperation, but more at the regional level, with these blocks being quite distinct from each other, quite a lot, including in the new internet economy, or indeed a completely anarchic world of just power determining trade relations and legal agreements. Not lasting long. Might talk about this after. The implications for Europe of all this. I mean, what I've been looking at the EU and how it's set up. You do see signs of it kind of tooling up for this era of increased geoeconomic competition. Notably, even with soft policies like development aid, you see there's a new proposal from the Commission to make one new instrument combining all the different legal instruments the EU had for cooperation with Africa, South America, the Middle East, wherever. And this is including, as well as the traditional development objectives, it's including other instruments that are just commercial or economic cooperation, say supporting joint ventures with Japan or whatever it might be, as well as it's got a lot about security and of course migration management in there. Now this is still supposed to be, I must check the figures, over 80%, officially development aid, but I think it does show the EU using even its development policy, trying to ensure that it can be used as a more effective political instrument for geoeconomics or for security. Again, this is in line with what lots of other countries are doing as well. You see, even in Germany, often regarded as the most perhaps liberal state without the UK, and the UK's departure from the EU does reduce the neoliberal element within it significantly. You talk of a new industrial policy and fending off Chinese investment in some key areas and directly supporting things like electric cars, some green energies, 3D printing and that. This again, we see tensions with the EU's competition law, which if people are familiar with, is all about reducing the dominance of certain firms in the market. And it's a very kind of neoliberal framework behind it. You can see this tension recently with the Alstom-Siemens proposed merger, which the European Commission seems to be blocking. I think the French and German governments like, because they can create a new kind of champion that can compete with the US and the EU. Generally, I suppose I don't want to do a plot spoiler about Brexit because I don't really know what will happen more than anyone else. It's very likely that the UK will sooner or later end up following the EU's rules anyway and remaining within the EU economic zone. Now, for Ireland, of course, the details of that are important. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be a messy no-deal scenario in the meantime. So that's not much comfort for Ireland, but that would be, I think, my analysis of where it will end up, because, in fact, the way the world has developed, which with this new harsher trade politics, reinforces the need for the EU as a geoeconomic bloc. It is noteworthy that if countries like Hungary or populist governments in Poland and that don't want to leave the EU, they want to take it over and use its power in a different way. Generally, I was going to end with the classic quote from Gramsci about the way of the world, that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. Although I would say if the new is Trump and Bolsonaro and Orban and Putin, maybe it's better that it isn't born. I would say on a more, I think, optimistic note, the neoliberal frame that there is no alternative but the market and so on. This had to end, and it's a good thing that it has ended, and there are opportunities for those who want more a progressive change in this scenario. But I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Patrick. That was fascinating. I think it's interesting that I think sometimes here in Ireland we could be accused of having a frame of reference in relation to Brexit which is very narrow, and I think you've alluded to some of the more broader to the broader context within which we might understand the forces that are driving Brexit and the way in which it may manifest itself. So thanks very much for that. We'll open to the floor for questions.
Yeah.
Just one point there, you're saying that because the UK is very large, the EU has to worry about the whole free trade element that they're looking for.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, is the further issue that it could be a conduit, if they insist on the free trade policy, a conduit for goods from elsewhere to come through into Europe without checks or without proper guarantees?
Yeah. Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, that's exactly the issue. So the details are if the UK goes outside of the customs union and has different tariffs and can sign different kinds of free trade agreements, and then is outside of the single market, which includes lots of laws, but also specific laws about safety and environmental standards. And there are two issues. One is simply the practical one that the Commission would emphasise. It's their responsibility. They've taken away powers from EU member states, and it's their responsibility to ensure, the safety of goods. They don't want, some damaged or dodgy agricultural products coming in from the US or South America that might not be in line with European ecological standards. They don't want, dodgy toys coming in from somewhere that the UK signed a free trade deal in. But it's also about power as well. The major source of European power in the world is this unified economic bloc, which has an external face. And if a large part of the European economy, the UK, is outside of that, that would create all kinds of problems. So yeah.
Thanks very much, Patrick. I suppose what I'm wondering about here is that there's an element I want to kind of ask about, which is the element of these changes which are driven by the irrational and the viscerally ethno-national forces that we now see being mobilized in Hungary, in Poland, in Italy, in Spain, in the United States, in Brazil, and all these places. Because while one can understand it as a pushback against neoliberalism, because of the impact it has on the left behinds and so on, arguably the best way to deal with all that is by using multilateral and sovereignty sharing international frameworks to create a more just world. Whereas it's as if we seem to be about to lurch from what we've had up to now, maybe an excessive degree of reliance on the market, to a return to, I think, largely 19th century atavisms, or maybe the 1930s. It feels like the 1930s now. But doesn't that very factor then, that lurch backwards into ethno-nationalism, actually make it all the more difficult and challenging to find some new framework at international level whereby we can address these issues and really find solutions? We seem to be going back towards the might is right kind of model of international geopolitics. I don't know what your view. I'm not putting it very clearly, but what?
You are. No, I agree with that. And in fact, one thing I forgot to mention, is I think the worst aspect of this change is for dealing with climate change, where the potential for cooperation is actually greatly reduced now. at least in this neoliberal world, there was a potential. It wasn't enough, and a lot of blather about green economy and sustainable development. But it was something. Whereas in this world that seems to be emerging of blocs and great powers doing their own things without having common laws, I think it makes it even more difficult. For developing countries, generally, I think there are pros and cons of this new era. They have a lot more choices who they deal with. They can get cash maybe from China or perhaps from Brazil or India, as well as the Europeans and the World Bank. But for climate change, I think it's a disaster, apart from Trump's specific policies, and obviously Bolsonaro even more so. But no, I very much agree. I'm struck by, I don't know who said the phrase, that the devil has the best tunes. But in terms of opposition to globalization and the unfairnesses of the WTO, this was obviously from the left originally. The Battle of Seattle in 1999. This was trade unions and left-wing progressive groups that wanted to change this. But we didn't see that the real force against it would come from right-wing forces within the capitalist core. And it does, maybe not always, but it often seems that these more atavistic kind of tribal forces seem to be able to do more, have more political capability than nice, rational, cosmopolitan global civil society. This seems to be the thing. Obviously, they're more geared to a state and how it functions anyway, because you can try and take power in a state like Trump did. But that's what really struck me. And I remember, against my best instincts, I watched Steve Bannon at some debate, just to see what he had to say. And he basically gave what would have been a classic undergraduate essay in about 2000 about the evils of globalization. Now, of course, his answer to this is Sarah Palin and Trump and God knows what. But which there's no answer whatsoever. But they've co-opted this valid critique about transnational capitalism, but to I think what is it, a dead end. A couple of other points though that I think are worth noting. Obviously, I speak in very broad terms. I'm not yet sure if like deglobalization per se is happening, because production is so kind of transnational. It's very hard to see how that would actually happen now, like a complete rewinding of trade openness. What we've got instead is globalization still, but with much more of an authoritarian and a realpolitik kind of twist to it. So it's a bit subtle. It's not exactly like we're back in the 1930s or before that, even though some of the rhetoric that remind us of that. I also, in regard to what you said, I was doing some reading for a different lecture. Reading is good. And about Joseph Chamberlain, about who he's best known here for his anti-home rule stuff, but he was big on the first major leader in Britain to complain about its free trade policies. And again, he had valid arguments. He was saying in the early 20th century, this free trade kind of rhetoric about comparative advantage is no good if you're hungry and you haven't got a job and so on. But he added to it a lot of nasty xenophobic stuff about Eastern Europe, Jewish people and others coming to London and they're not clean, and this is all part of free trade as well. So there's a kind of the constructive opposition to free trade, and then there's the atavistic one, and it's a real problem and a challenge, including for NGOs. How much do they use nationalism? NGOs used, in the case of the proposed TTIP with the United States, this broad, very deep free trade agreement, NGOs kind of used a bit of Euro nationalism, a bit of almost anti-Americanism, slightly exaggerated what was in TTIP even to kind of reinforce their own case for not signing it, emphasizing that Germany's a better run country than the US, and so you don't want their standards. But it was a problem for NGOs. But definitely the key to politics in general is you've got to find something that mobilizes and inspires people as much as the basic fear and tribalism can. I think that's the key.
I suppose it is a comment in one sense that one of the attractions about neoliberalism is that it argued that you really actually didn't have to think about what you did, that market forces would essentially in the end come up with the best solutions. And they argue that by reducing the state, that this was the best way to implement that idea. So then when neoliberalism collapses or runs into problems, as it did in 2008, the state doesn't actually have the capacity or the ideas or theories as to how you actually deal with that, because what it's showing up is actually no, the market won't solve the problem. It's a lot more complicated than that, and actually we don't have the capacity within the public system to actually deal with that. And I think for social democratic parties who essentially bought into markets will do it, and then you know, sort of we deal with the social justice element. That's where you end up with, well, how do we move on, and how do we actually live in a world that we all want to live with? And I think that's one of the things that's basically the political systems and political parties are going to have to start to understand that actually the public interest is best served through democracy, no matter how imperfect that is, because benign dictators just do not exist. And I think it's to make those arguments that the capacity of the state and the capacity of state institutions are actually what's critical in the aftermath of essentially where economics went down the wrong road, and it has to essentially pull back from that and start to argue, well, actually economists do need to think about values and you know, where do we want to go to and what objectives. You can't have this kind of value-free theories about how you allocate resources or how you come up with the best solutions.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I mean, neoliberalism is very powerful because it's a simple idea. It's quite compelling in its own terms. It makes sense, you know, as a theory. But yeah, what happens, like you said, in a moment of crisis is the state, all right, it intervenes, but it just ends up in a trivial way. That ferry company was an example. It just ends up throwing money at certain companies in some cronyist or kind of ad hoc way, rather than having some kind of deeper approach to doing things. The same essentially is what happened with the banking sector. Imagine if that money could have been used for something more long term, and that's what strikes me about Brexit as well. For years, you know, we've been told that you couldn't do anything that would upset international investors and big companies. You know, that this was madness. This was just the way the world is. And now Britain has taken them to the brink. They don't even know what their basic trading terms will be in 2 months, and also is willing to, you know, forsake billions. You know, imagine if that kind of sacrifice or that political front was there to be used for something else, as opposed to you know, what most people would say is a project that's a bit of a dead end project. Brexit. Yeah. Are you an economist here? So?
Yes.
Yeah. Good.
I might just abuse the chair's position and one last question, because I'm conscious of time. Trump is there 2 years now, and he may only be there for another 2 years. So to what extent might some of this be temporary? You know, might this be a temporary blip in you know, in the evolving world order? And the same with Brexit. I mean, Brexit will happen, and at some point it will reach a conclusion. So do you have any thoughts on? Yeah,
I do. The Trump one is interesting. I tend to think that he's just broken so many taboos, and he's articulated what a lot of people think about trade, just, you know, in a simple way. Yeah, imports, you know, bad, exports good, and they're cheating us, and so on. It's strange to see how it could ever go back to the polite consensus there was. Also, with regard to China, at least, not Mexico, obviously. That's, you know, nonsense. The poor US has been bullied by Mexico for years, you know. But about China, I think there's quite broad support, even in Congress, even some Democrats, for trade conflict with China to a degree. So I think yes, it will. He will hopefully be gone soon. But I don't think that the fabric can be entirely retorn or refitted. So. Yeah, as for Brexit, again, that's depending on how it goes, could end up being more of a blip. But again, they did, particularly in that referendum, they brought up a lot of issues just to win it that had been slightly outside of the the public, where exactly money goes and this kind of thing. So yeah, I agree. It's open, and these guys and their options are kind of including that. But I just don't see how at the global trade level there could be agreement between China and America, and they're the key actors because China's in the WTO now. America will say that the WTO laws aren't suited for a country like China because it's not really liberal capitalist and the Communist Party in the state. But there's no way China's going to agree to redo the laws so that they're stricter on it. So that I think is a real permanent kind of tension. But yeah, as for the rest, yeah, who knows?
I guess we live in hope. Well, thanks very much indeed, Patrick. It's been great to have you here, and it's been great to get Brexit from that perspective as well, because I think maybe I'm certainly guilty of being a little more focused on the Irish context when it's a much broader question than that. So thanks for joining us from Plymouth via Waterford.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Thanks everyone for the questions.
And thanks again.
Really go through your lecture with the fan call beforehand, in case there's anything slightly offensive or prejudicial, you know.
Yeah, but then if we're not
Racial
here
and
to
sexual
debate, I mean, we're here to debate ideas, and you have to say the unsayable,
Have to keep it
and it
open
has to be a
mind.
safe space.
Yeah.
It really is probably right.
Yeah, the worst of what I used to be dealing with was giving out a bit of a feel for too much. God, it was a simpler world.
All very harmless.
It was, do you know, when you look back at it now, like it's, those were trivial problems, really, in the grand scheme of
It's moved on.
the grand scheme of things. The world has moved on, you know.
The only thing we were saying earlier on, Teresa, you might have a view on this as well. I mean, in Ireland in particular, the alt-right has very little purchase. And I'm wondering, is that because Sinn Féin occupies the place in the spectrum which might otherwise become a hotbed of...
To a large extent, but we have a lot of data from the election study which shows that the views are there. Like it's
I suppose
2020.
Peter Casey showed
Peter
that as well.
Casey is a
25%.
classic example.
Like if you ask questions